It's difficult to talk about having a position on the Underground Railroad in 1858 because, of course, as soon as you articulated it, you were liable to arrest. This continues to be a major problem in the historiography of the Underground Railroad, because after the Civil War, everyone's happy to jump up and say, oh yes, I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And other people are thinking, wait a minute. And the problem is sometimes very difficult to prove one way or the other. In terms of civil disobedience, though, of course, Stephen A. Douglas has no use whatsoever for protecting runaway slaves. Runaway slaves are a destabilizing element. Runaway slaves are an embarrassment. Slaves are supposed to be property. Slaves are supposed to be like horses, chickens, goats. When did you ever hear about a goat making a bolt for Canada? When did you ever hear about a horse running away for freedom? And Lincoln, in fact, points that out. He says, if human beings are really property, then why do we have a population of 500,000 free blacks in the North? Who ever heard about a free horse or a free goat or a free pig? So that's a contradiction. He says all the laws about property are right and true when they're applied properly, but not to human beings. So Douglas, of course, is perfectly happy with that. And Lincoln dissents from it. But at the same time, Lincoln is very chary about this idea of civil disobedience, about flouting the fugitive slave law. His response to the fugitive slave law is to ignore it. Not to obey it, but not to disobey it. Because one thing that Lincoln is very concerned about is this. If you look at the situation, a political situation of any sort, and you come to the conclusion that this political situation is wrong, it's oppressive in its nature, and therefore you're licensed to do whatever it takes to bring it down, where do you stop? If you dignify some kind of breaking of law and call it civil disobedience in one area, will that not, in fact, tear down the structures of law in every other area? Where do you draw a stop to it? And Lincoln was very much afraid that in a republic, where our structures are not made out of traditions or out of aristocrats or out of customs, but out of laws, then civil disobedience was in fact exactly the worst thing that you could perform in a democracy. Because while on the one hand it would seem to be championing the good, it was in fact destroying the credibility of everything else that held the society up and held it together. Were we a society of men, Lincoln asked, in other words, of kings and dictators and tyrants, or were we a society of laws? The appropriate way to deal with unjust laws is to change the laws. If you bring down laws and bring them into disrepute, you bring the democracy itself to a point of weakness. So Lincoln would in fact never recommend defiance of the fugitive slave law. He would advocate repealing it, revoking it, but not defiance of it. In that case, the cure would be worse than the disease. So between Lincoln and Douglas, there seems at first to be not a huge amount of difference. But between Lincoln and Douglas, there is in fact a universe of difference, but it hangs on the sanctity of law.
Fair enough. I enjoyed it tremendously. We as a people are not ever told that Lincoln was not our great savior. Most believe it and think it because the children's books tell them that. Whenever that is gone back and corrected, maybe that will help. And you mentioned something about people. Are we not all the same? But is it not still on the books? And through Darwin's theory that blacks are not equal to Caucasians due to the fact, that's how we have been counted. I don't recall ever seeing this law taken off the books. Also, if those laws were not continued to be debated, And if all Caucasians could walk in a black man's or woman's shoe, live in their skin, those laws would not be there. I feel as though it's been a subject that's been conveniently tossed around by others who have the rules and the laws to keep us as an inferior product. But yet have we not proven as a people that we work as hard, intelligent as, and if we were given the opportunity to have that power as others do, those laws would not be there. And it should not be for all of America, which belongs to all of us because we've done our time, during our time and work. And I still see us with the status of not being equal. It's just like when you said the bathroom, color, bathroom. It's different, but it still was not the same. The toilet flushed, but it still had inferior.
It had stigma attached to it.
Oh yeah. And now what I see, and I see it so strongly, and maybe you're not aware of it as a people, but there's subtle difference. It's a smile sometimes. And I guess no one's gonna ever like everybody all the time, because there's some of my own I might not like. There's some you might not like. But I don't know what it would take to say, aren't we a people? That's all. Thank you.
This reminds me of a comment that was made, curiously enough, of all places in the world, in the parlor of the Wilmer McLean House at Appomattox. I've been to I take my classes to Appomattox once a year. And the McLean House is still there. And you can walk in and look at the parlor where General Lee surrendered to General Grant, where it all ended, April 9th, 1865. On that occasion, on April 9th, 1865, Lee made his surrender of his army to General Grant, bringing effectively the military aspect of the war to a close. And on that occasion, all of Grant's staff were there, including Grant's private secretary, Colonel Eli S. Parker. Parker was unusual from the other staff officers that Grant had there, because Parker, who was an engineer and had known Grant before the war in Galena, Illinois, Parker was a full-blooded Seneca Indian. He was a chieftain, a sachem of the Seneca. But he had the most gorgeous copperplate handwriting. And Grant, of course, Grant had nothing but a chicken scratch scrawl. So Grant leaned heavily on Parker to make out the fair copies of orders. And on the occasion of the surrender at Appomattox, it was Parker who wrote out the multiform copies, the triplicate copies of the surrender orders, which Lee signed. Once the signing ceremony was done, Grant began to introduce Lee to the members of his staff, one by one, going around the room. And then to Parker, Colonel Parker. Lee stopped and stared at him. And this ruffle of uneasiness went through the room. Did Lee think he was being insulted by being introduced to an Indian? Lee had been an old Indian fighter out on the plains. Worse still, did Lee think that Parker, with his swarthy complexion, was a black man? And that Grant was rubbing it into Lee's face? And then after a moment, Lee proffered his hand to Parker and said to him, "Colonel Parker, I'm glad at least to meet a real American." Then Parker said the thing which makes him dear. "General Lee," he said, "we are all Americans." God bless him for that.